In July of 2005, my wife and I and our kids, Spencer and Taylor, took a trip to the Cancun, Mexico area. We decided to rent a private home on the beach about 30 miles south of Cancun in what is now referred to as the Mayan Riviera. The house was a very large three-story home in Playa Paradiso, which is also known as Paradise Beach. We had a week of great weather, enjoyed the beach, went to see some of the local Mayan ruins, and were relaxing, when on July 16th the housekeeper asked me if it would be okay for guys to work on the windows. I said sure. I went out front for a few minutes and came back in to see several of the windows facing the ocean were all boarded up. I immediately yelled for my wife, who speaks fluent Spanish, to ask them what they were doing. After a short conversation, the one word that rang out was cyclone. I didn't have to be fluent Spanish or road scholar to figure out a hurricane was on the way. I immediately turned on the TV and tried to find out anything about the weather. I decided to go a few miles down the road to a nearby resort called the Mayan Palace. Mayan Palace caters to tourists, so I figured they would have more information. Once I arrived there, their lobby is full of people and luggage trying to get out onto shuttles and go to the airport. I stopped a manager who told me that a hurricane expected by tomorrow night, and they were in a level 3 emergency, meaning get out if you can. Hurricane Emily was coming right at us. I left there and drove about 30 miles to the airport to see about flying out early the next morning. When I got to the airport, it was wall-to-wall people trying to get out of Mexico. Since tourists in the U.S. knew about the impending hurricane, they were canceling their trips. In turn, airlines had canceled most incoming flights so they would be empty and decided not to bring their airplanes in. Never made it to the counter, and after a couple hours, I decided to head back to the Mayan Palace for another update. The concierge at the Mayan Palace said the Hurricane Emily had now been upgraded to a Category 5, which is the strongest and most damaging type of hurricane. He also said they are predicting 30-foot-high water surges and battering waves. My first thought was, our rental house is on the beach and it's about 30 feet tall. His guests on the third floors are going to be allowed to stay in their rooms since the resort sits back from the water. This sounded like a smarter option to me, and to have access to English-speaking people and employees was a benefit. So, many of the guests had left, so getting a room wouldn't be a problem, so I left to talk it over with my wife. I got back to the house, told my wife what was going on. We were both decided that with 2 young kids we needed to rent a room at the Mayan Palace and play it safe. It was still a beautifully sunny day with a little wind, but hardly a cloud in the sky. You'd never know Hurricane Emily was on her way. Hurricane Emily was now Category 5 status and bearing down on Cozumel and heading directly at us. Darn near could have drawn the line pointing at Playa Paradiso from this path coming in. We decided to pack lightly, but put everything else on the third floor of the house and inside the closets. The next day was sunny. The wind had definitely picked up and was now very strong. And about 1 p.m. after lunch, the 4 of us left for the Mayan Palace. Once we checked in, we were immediately informed to bring no more than a pillowcase, since we were all being evacuated to an air-conditioned hurricane shelter. We were bused to a large concrete building with no windows, led through a large air-conditioned room with TVs loaded with people. You couldn't even stretch your legs. We continued to follow our escort through a hole that had recently been made in the cement cinder block wall. There were still chunks laying around, and 2 guys with sledgehammers standing nearby. They obviously weren't finished with the hole. This large room was part of their warehouse. No air conditioning, no TVs, and people packed in there as well. We established our area, but I was later told that over 1,500 people were inside this shelter that was built for 550 guests. The extra were family members of the staff. Over the next 18 hours, we were fed well since they anticipated all electricity and refrigerators going out. The staff worked very hard and were actually very good. We could hear the storm outside throughout the night, and around 2 a.m. when the back part of the storm hit, the power went out. Due to the humidity and hot July weather, it was getting worse in the shelter. We all survived the shelter, and in the morning when we were allowed out, we were amazed and awestruck in seeing the damage. Trees were broken in half, glass from broken windows was all over, cars had been moved in the water surge. It looked like a battle had just occurred. We went to our room and tried to get some sleep, but the heat and humidity were horrible. I found out that keeping your sliding glass door and front door open for any form of air movement was not possible, unless you wanted to be covered with very large bugs that had come in with the storm. I decided we couldn't stay at the Mayan Palace any longer, especially since the pool and beach were closed due to the glass and other debris that had covered the area. I decided to go back to the house, and it was trash, broken windows, trees broken in half, and there was a concern about looters. I gathered the rest of our belongings and decided to drive to Cancun to see about available hotel rooms. I felt a bit guilty driving the 30 miles of Cancun while in the air-conditioned rental car, but I didn't feel that bad. After passing gas stations that had been torn apart, billboards that looked like a giant had bent them in half, and trees and debris all over the roadway, I arrived in the tourist mecca, the Cancun Hotel Zone. After the first 10 hotels were totally booked, since they had already had power restored, normal since they would take care of the tourist area first, that's their number one source of income there in Mexico, I arrived at the very plush Royal Sands. It was air-conditioned, had a gorgeous pool, bellboys dressed in all white. I looked like a sweaty beach bum, and after jokingly asked the hurricane special price, I was happy to hear that they had a one-room available. The desk clerk told me proudly that it wasn't just a room, it was a suite, and available at the low rate of $450 a night. After initial shock, I remembered my family sitting back in the sweltering hotel room 30 miles south. I didn't have much of a choice, so agreed to stay there for the next 4 nights before our scheduled flight back to the U.S.